1877 saw a brutal Texas range war stop dead in its tracks. It wasn't ended by the cavalry or a lawman, but by a 14-year-old boy. This is how a single telegraph key saved a county. The Texas frontier had become a powder keg. Two heavily armed cattle factions were locked in a bitter blood feud over grazing rights and stolen livestock. With dozens already dead, both sides prepared for a final catastrophic slaughter that threatened to tear the entire territory apart. Caught in the center of this impending massacre was a 14-year-old orphan named Arthur Miller, working out of a dusty, isolated wooden shack. Arthur was the town's sole telegraph operator. He spent his long days tapping out mundane messages about grain shipments and weather reports, barely earning enough to keep himself fed. But Arthur had a unique gift. He wasn't just fast with the Morse code key. He possessed an uncanny ability to read the unsaid emotions behind the frantic tapping. He understood that the copper wires carried more than just letters. They carried fear, anger, and desperation. As the tensions in town escalated, Arthur's little station quietly became the only functional line of communication between the two rival cattle barons. The uneasy silence broke on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. The leader of the northern faction, a ruthless man named Thaddeus Thorne, stormed into Arthur's station. His face was flushed with rage, and his hand rested menacingly on his revolver. Thorne slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the counter and demanded Arthur send it immediately to his rival Sterling Holloway. Arthur unfolded the note, his blood running cold. It was a vicious declaration of war, explicitly threatening to burn Holloway's ranch to the ground and slaughter his family. Arthur knew that the moment he tapped out this message, the shooting would start. Hundreds of men would die in the crossfire. His ink-stained fingers hovered over the brass key, trembling in the heat of the shack. He was just a boy, but in that terrifying instant, he held the fate of the entire county in his hands. Terrified but desperate to prevent a massacre, Arthur made a split-second decision that carried a guaranteed death sentence if he were caught. Instead of transmitting the violent threats, he began to systematically alter the message. He softened the insults, stripping away the promises of arson and murder. He transformed a brutal declaration of war into a stern but reasonable list of grievances about water rights. When Sterling Holloway received the telegram on the other end, he was surprised by the diplomatic tone. Holloway dictated a response that was equally hot-headed, but when it reached Arthur's desk, the boy worked his magic again. He scrubbed the venom from the reply before handing it to Thorne. Arthur had just committed federal treason by tampering with the mail and forging communications between two killers. He kept the original bloodthirsty notes hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his office, a secret stash of evidence that could hang him. For the next 3 weeks, Arthur lived a double life, acting as a secret one-man peace treaty. To the townspeople, he was just the quiet, unassuming telegraph boy, sweeping the floors and keeping to himself. Behind that wooden counter, he was orchestrating a complex, high-stakes, diplomatic negotiation. He began to invent apologies, carefully weaving them into the daily transmissions. He would tell Thorne that Holloway deeply regretted a misunderstanding over stray calves, and he would tell Holloway that Thorne was willing to compromise on river access. Arthur found himself pouring his own desperate hope for peace into these fabricated messages. He wasn't just changing words. He was building a bridge of empathy between two men who had sworn to kill each other. The boy who had lost his own family to front violence was now risking everything to ensure that no one else in his town would suffer the same tragic fate. The delicate illusion nearly shattered when one of Thorne's top lieutenants rode into town, boasting about the impending war. He had heard rumors that Sterling Holloway was secretly amassing a private army, a direct contradiction to the peaceful telegrams Arthur had been delivering. Thaddeus Thorne confronted the boy, demanding to see the physical telegraph logs to verify the transcriptions himself. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. If Thorne saw the discrepancies between the incoming Morse code tape and the written translations, the boy would be shot on the spot. If you want to hear more incredible, forgotten stories of history's unsung heroes who risked it all, hit that subscribe button right now. Arthur managed to feign a clumsy accident with a spilled inkwell, ruining the physical logs just moments before Thorn could inspect them. He survived the encounter, but the close call made one thing terrifyingly clear. His web of lies was completely unsustainable and the clock was ticking. Arthur realized he could not keep playing this dangerous game of telephone forever. Eventually, the two factions were bound to cross paths on the open range, and the truth would spill out in a hail of gunfire. He had to force a resolution, and he had to do it immediately. In a staggering display of audacity, Arthur drafted two final, entirely fabricated telegrams. To Thaddeus Thorn, he wrote that Sterling Holloway was exhausted from the feud and wanted to meet unarmed at the town saloon to sign a formal truce. He sent the exact same message to Holloway, claiming the offer came from Thorn. He was setting up a face-to-face encounter between two heavily armed, deeply suspicious enemies. It was the point of no return. If they arrived and realized they had been tricked, the saloon would become a slaughterhouse, and Arthur would be the first casualty of his own desperate peace plan. The morning of the proposed meeting, the tension in the dusty frontier town was absolutely suffocating. Businesses shuttered their windows, and terrified residents locked their doors, bracing for a massacre. Arthur sat alone in his telegraph shack, watching through the dirt-caked window as Thaddeus Thorn and his men rode into town from the north. Moments later, Sterling Holloway's crew appeared from the south. Both sides were bristling with rifles, clearly violating the terms of the unarmed truce Arthur had invented. A heavy moral dilemma weighed on the teenager's shoulders. He could easily slip out the back door, steal a horse, and ride away, saving his own life and leaving these stubborn men to destroy each other. If he ran, his weeks of desperate, terrifying work would be for absolutely nothing. He had to stay and see his monumental gamble through to the bitter end, no matter the cost to himself. The two cattle barons dismounted and walked slowly toward the center of the muddy street, stopping just outside the saloon doors. The silence was deafening, broken only by the jingle of spurs and the howling prairie wind. Arthur crept out of his shack, hiding behind a wooden water trough, his chest heaving with silent, ragged breaths. Thorn and Holloway locked eyes, their hands hovering dangerously close to their holstered pistols. Neither man spoke. They were waiting for the other to acknowledge the apologies and the offer of peace that had supposedly been transmitted over the wire. The air crackled with lethal anticipation. One wrong move, one sudden twitch, and the street would erupt in a deafening chorus of gunfire. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, praying that the seeds of diplomacy he had planted would somehow take root in this scorched earth before the first shot was fired. Thaddeus Thorn finally broke the agonizing silence. He crossed his arms and gruffly told Holloway that he appreciated the olive branch, and that he was willing to accept the apology for the stolen cattle. Sterling Holloway looked completely bewildered. He immediately snapped back, declaring that he had not apologized for anything, and that it was Thorn who had begged for forgiveness over the telegraph wire. The confusion rapidly morphed into explosive anger. Both men realized simultaneously that they had been played for absolute fools. Their hands dropped to their revolvers, their men raising their rifles in the background. "Who wrote those messages?" Thorn bellowed, his voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. The awful truth dawned on them. There was only one person in the entire county who controlled the telegraph wires. 24 furious, heavily armed cowboys slowly turned their gaze toward the wooden trough where a trembling 14-year-old boy was hiding. Dragged by his collar into the center of the street, Arthur faced certain execution. Thaddeus Thorn drew his pistol, demanding to know why the boy had forged the communications. With a gun pressed to his head, Arthur did not beg for his life. Instead, he pointed to the loose floorboard in his shack. He told them to read the original messages. Holloway's men retrieved the hidden stash of original, unaltered telegrams. As the two hardened cattle barons read their own bloodthirsty unhinged threats out loud, a strange thing happened. Seeing their raw hatred captured on paper, stripped of the heat of the moment, made them realize the utter insanity of their feud. They saw how close they had come to mutually assured destruction. The boy had not just changed their words, he had saved them from their own worst impulses. The guns slowly went back into their holsters. What would you have done in Arthur's position? Tell me in the comments. The roar of Winchesters never came. Instead, the standoff ended with the heavy exhale of men who were suddenly tired of hating each other. Thaddeus Thorne and Sterling Holloway, two giants of the territory, looked at the ink-stained boy and then at each other. Without a word, they walked together into the saloon, calling for a single bottle of whiskey. For 3 hours they sat at a scarred table, using Arthur's forged compromises as a blueprint for a real peace treaty. Outside, the townspeople began to creep from their homes, squinting in the harsh Texas sun. They looked around in a daze, struggling to understand how the most violent day in the county's history had simply vanished. Arthur sat on the dusty boardwalk, his legs trembling so hard he could not stand. He had faced down 2 private armies in one, armed with nothing but a brass telegraph key and a necessary lie. In a turn of events that no one in the territory could have predicted, Arthur Miller was not punished for his manipulation of the telegraph wires. Instead, Thaddeus Thorne and Sterling Holloway recognized something in the boy that they lacked in themselves, a genius for finding common ground. The two rivals actually pooled their resources to hire the 14-year-old orphan as their official, joint mediator. They paid him triple his old salary, turning a starving boy into the most influential voice in the county. Arthur had proven that even in a land ruled by the gun, a few carefully chosen words could disarm 100 men. It is stories like this that remind us how one person can change the course of history. If you enjoyed following Arthur's journey from the shadows, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible true story from the frontier. The story of the boy who saved a county in 1877 is more than just a legend of the Old West. It is a reminder that conflict is rarely inevitable, and that violence is usually just what happens when we stop listening. In a world where disputes were settled with lead and shallow graves, Arthur Miller used a simple brass key to outsmart an entire territory of hardened killers. He showed everyone that the most heroic thing a person can do is refuse to pass along the anger of others. By rewriting the messages of hate into words of peace, he saved his own life and the lives of hundreds of men who never even knew his name. If you believe the world needs more stories like Arthur's, please subscribe and join us for our next journey into the past. We have more secrets from the frontier to share.